Right, so I have to admit to having been a little bit sceptical over this story, but I decided to dig into it given that this has been reported by the official BRICS News Twitter account. Verified account with the gold tick such accounts have these days since Elon Musk sold the blue ticks. The more I've dug into it though, the more it kind of makes sense in a way that in light of the historically low move by Israel, the act of terrorism as it was fundamentally in striking the Iranian embassy in the Syrian capital of Damascus, that a deal between the US and Iran has been done if Iran decides to retaliate against Israel, as has been threatened. It might sound counter to everything the US have said and done regarding Israel so far, but from the point of view of looking after themselves, it could be a logical conclusion to draw from this. Though certainly there are other media saying the complete opposite right now, but see what you make of this story. Right, so the US doing deals with Iran. Can you imagine it? Probably not, to be honest with you, especially if it is a choice between Israel and Iran and who they choose to back up between those two options. But as relations become more and more strained between the US and Netanyahu's crazed genocidal regime, not that has stopped the arms sales, of course, could there be a bit of an enough is enough moment here, especially given the circumstances of Israel's attack on Iran by, of all things, targeting an embassy, the deliberate targeting of which is a world history first. No nation has ever stooped that low as to target the embassy of a country that just happens to be in another country the aggressor is at war with. It shows a level of depravity, of not caring about the repercussions or lives, and with Israel seemingly always backed up by the US. Is that the reason Israel felt so emboldened as to take things as far as they have here? How do you deal with such a country in which case? I've made the comparison between Israel behaving like a spoilt brat on numerous occasions, with the US acting as the cosseting parent. But how do you break that cycle? You make the badly behaved child, or nation in this case, face up to the consequences and learn from it. Perhaps that is what we're seeing here, at least partially at any rate. You see, this story is currently being carried by BRICS News, the official account of all things to do with the BRICS nations, BRICS standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the 5 founding nations, but which now includes, amongst others, Iran. Developing economies, an economic body as BRICS ostensibly is. It is being drawn, nevertheless, into this Middle East crisis more and more, from the South Africa versus Israel International Court of Justice case to Russian warships aiding the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis also in talks with BRICS more directly, so potential membership for them on the horizon maybe. But if there is one thing that will have the US bulking at its support for Israel more than anything else, it is its status as an economic powerhouse, the wealthiest country in the world, and the fact that that is getting pinched in the Red Sea, and this is already giving them a lot of grief. With the Red Sea somewhat out of play for the US right now, so to speak, economically, through their own doing, it's their own fault, access to the oil-rich Middle East now depends on the Persian Gulf. Access to their Saudi friends, certainly. It's an economic issue to now upset Iran further because, well, Iran have a coastline on that Gulf. Military installations as they have across the Middle East as well will be potential targets for anyone else the US upset further in the region as well. And that actually brings us to the crux of this alleged deal with Iran. Here's what BRICS News have actually tweeted out. Just in, United States will not interfere if Iran attacks Israel. United States and Iran have come to an understanding. Iran assured the US it would not target US facilities, and in turn, the US said it would not get involved if Iran retaliated against Israel. Well, we know that Iran planned retaliation against Israel for targeting their embassy in Syria. They've said as much. It's not a nation known for forgive and forget over military strikes. It is also a seriously powerful nation in its own right, with ties to nations across the Middle East, who, if things kicked off between the US and Iran, would be pulled into the fighting as well in all likelihood. This would be a war with a number of different fronts. Not to mention, as members of BRICS, pressure would be on the other BRICS nations to then get involved too. And Russia is the one you would automatically think of there, but another BRICS nation that is quite relevant in this situation happens to be Egypt, who control the Suez Canal. And if the US thinks the Red Sea is difficult now, a second Suez crisis would definitely not help matters for them. There are a multitude of reasons to not get into it with Iran for the US, and far fewer, I would suggest, to choose to keep protecting Israel over that. And in fact, an article from the Jerusalem Post is largely in agreement with that BRICS News statement. They take a slightly different take. You have to bear in mind here that Jerusalem Post is a conservative right-wing Israeli paper. I suppose you could compare it to the Tory Graph or the Murdoch Times. So keep that in mind with this excerpt. An Iranian official said on Friday that Washington had warned Tehran not to attack US facilities after Iran had told it not to fall into Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trap. In a written message, the Islamic Republic of Iran warns US leadership not to get dragged in Netanyahu's trap for US. Stay away so you won't get hurt. In response, US asked Iran not to target American facilities. Iranian presidential aide Mohammad Jamshidi said on X on Friday, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, said in a statement published by Iranian news agencies, the malicious Zionist entity will receive its punishment at the hands of our brave men. We will make the Zionists regret the crime of attacking the Iranian consulate in Damascus and others like it. That article does seem to reinforce the fact that there has been some kind of a conversation between the US government and that of Iran, and is in line with the narrative of that BRICS News tweet saying, in response the US asked Iran not to target US facilities. That's two accounts repeating that now, one being Israeli itself. I don't think that is something that can necessarily just be dismissed out of hand just because it's getting next to no coverage at all, mainstream-wise, and it's being left to commentators like me to try and put these pieces together. But this is two accounts now bearing out that the US does not want to get into it with Iran, has asked Iran to leave its facilities alone if they attack Israel, but not to leave Israel itself alone. The US having been completely unaware of the strike on the Iranian embassy was going to happen, apparently, as the Jerusalem Post article also described further on in that post. It all amounts to Netanyahu now being thrown under the bus, it seems, by Genocide Joe, who won't stand in Iran's way as long as Iran leaves US facilities go. Iran, in turn, warning the US not to fall into any Israeli traps. My automatic thought is that Israel stage an attack on a US facility now and then get Mr. Pointy Daniel Agari out there to point at calendars on a wall again and claim it says something like, screw you with knobs on, Joe Biden, signed the Ayatollah, and say, here's proof, go bomb Tehran for us now. Don't fall for it. For as much as the US has been Israel's most ardent ally amid claims, dubious claims more often than not, but claims nonetheless that they've been targeted by Hamas or by Hezbollah or whoever, it's a whole different ballgame when the US know Iran have done nothing proactively themselves here to warrant the destruction of their embassy, the killing of their people there who were diplomats and members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It's a huge violation of international law. It was not a military installation despite Israeli claims to the contrary, and there is no way in hell it is either appropriate or worth it to the US to get into the middle of that. The retaliation by Iran, you obviously fear for Israeli civilian casualties as you ponder it. But it's a mess Israel has made for itself, that Netanyahu has made for himself. Out of control as that nation is, and they have to face the consequences of their actions now. They have to be made to face up to it. Grow up. Of course, on the complete flip side of this, there are more establishment media seemingly drowning this story out, with many Western titles warning of the US apparently bracing itself for attacks by Iran. But Iran's issue is with Israel, not the US. So the likes of AP News, The Guardian, CNN and Fox News, I'm less convinced by their narratives as they simply make less sense. Of course, my thinking is predicated on logical conclusions for the US, and with nobody quite sure if Joe Biden's mind is in the right place from one day to the next, who knows if this may change, I just don't see Israel as being worth it to them to end up in a war that won't just be with Iran, as bad enough on its own as that would be, but would widen this conflict still further, possibly dragging Russia more proactively into it. China even, India, Egypt, South Africa, drag more of the world into this. And it would beg the question yet again, what more would it take for the US to finally give up on Israel for good, regard it as a rogue state, and leave it to the consequences of its actions? I'd hope we've reached that point here, but as always, we'll have to wait and see. And I won't hold my breath, especially as those arms sales from the US carry on happening. But meanwhile, back here in the UK, we're still dealing with the aftermath of Israel having deliberately targeted 3 Britons as part of the attack on the World Central Kitchen, aid workers, the lives of 30,000 dead Palestinians not having elicited a governmental shift here, but 3 Britons have gone some way further towards that, which is just racist really, but that is where we're at. But still short of that arms embargo we need now from unelected Foreign Secretary David Cameron, now being demanded even more since it appears to have been a drone using a British-designed engine that fired those fatal missiles into those trucks being used by those aid workers. More on that story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.